Welcome to Lecture 4 in Phil's Critical Thinking, uh, part of our ongoing series of how to think about COVID and try to get a university degree at the same time. So today's topic is fallacies of presumption. We're going to do this 7 fallacies with some subcategories on top of that. I think I'm going to break it up into 2 videos. So we're going to do, I think, 4 and then 3. So fallacies of presumption. These are fallacies where there is some hidden assumption or missing information that only once you sort of identify the missing piece do you understand how the argument is convincing, even though it is not a good argument. Just remind us ourselves what the deal is with fallacies. These are arguments that fail. These are not arguments that are logically convincing. At the same time, they often look like they are. And so that's why the fallacies that we're talking about are those fallacies that are bad arguments that look good, that they'll trick you. They're a bait and switch. Remember that arguments are a series of statements intended to establish a conclusion. A good argument is if the premises are true, that makes the conclusion likely be true. We learned that a valid argument, that very important word valid, is those arguments that guarantee the conclusion must be true. And these fallacies are not valid, they're not good. These are problematic arguments. Some of them, and we'll see some today, that sort of masquerade as valid arguments, even though they're not good. So we're gonna get into that a little bit. So when we're looking at these presumption fallacies, we want to understand this concept of warrant and unwarranted presumptions and assumptions. This concept of warrant in logic is an important one, and it's almost as simple as it sounds. If you're familiar with, and I kind of hope you're not, the idea of having a warrant for your arrest, that means that someone has gone somewhere and convinced a judge or some authority that there is good reason for you to be rounded up and brought in. So warrant in law means sort of a good reason has been proven. When we talk about an idea having warrant or a statement having warrant, what we mean is that there is a good reason to accept it. And so really it's good reason, right? So then you have an unwarranted presumption. That's a presumption you make without good reason. And these are, so you're going to look at all these fallacies today where there's something that sneaks in without good reason. We're going to look at these. So if you want to see a list of all the fallacies, there it is. I'm planning to get to the end of converse accident in this first video. I'll take a pause and then break it up so it's not ridiculously long. So let's get right into it. False cause. The form is to falsely identify cause based on coincidence. So this is an unwarranted presumption of cause, even when there is no basis for that. And we're going to see when we get into the induction section of the course, attributing cause is pretty tricky. And so in a way, it's not surprising that there's bad thinking here because the logic of this is complicated. As a very straightforward example, every time I fall asleep, it gets dark. And you might think that if you're in the habit of going to bed before it gets dark. And well, is that really a causal relationship or is it coincidence? The false cause fallacy has lots of variants, and those variants sometimes get Latin names. So we have post hoc, cum hoc, and non causa. These are all slightly different versions. So the post is when one thing succeeds another. You think, well, the first thing must have been the cause and the second the effect. Cum hoc is when two things always happen together. You think that therefore they're causal. Non-cause is sort of a more general category. I see a lot of reversing cause and effect. Um, all Trump's talk about, uh, you know, uh, testing being the result of increased cases. We should stop testing in order to decrease the number of cases we have. I think that is the fallacy of reversing cause and effect. The infection rate is causing the increasing testing results, not the other way around. There's a pretty good slogan to keep in mind here that scientists like to keep front of mind, which is that correlation does not equal causation. Even if you have strongly correlated results, that does not mean that one thing causes another. And there's a great website called spuriouscorrelations.com, which let's take a few minutes to look at this. So these are uh, correlations that are statistically significant, even though they are clearly, sorry, I'll get this organized here, clearly not um, causally related. So first one, and if you look at the example in this, it's spurious correlations. If you Google that, this website will pop up first. So a statistical correlation here for those of you that might be in a stats class this term, 99.79%. That's correlated, right? That's as close as you can get. Except that the two things that are correlated to that accuracy are suicides by hanging, strangulation, suffocation, and U.S. spending on science, space, and technology. Why are those things correlated? It's probably random, right? Number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Again, now this is only correlation. Notice the graphs spread around a little bit more, but a correlation of 66%. That's nothing to get too excited about. Per capita cheese consumption correlating with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Correlation of 94.7. That's pretty good. If that was your master's thesis in some science discipline, you'd get a pass on that. Divorce rate in Maine, correlating with per capita consumption of margarine. And having looked at the way he's gathered his data, he's looking at divorce rate in Maine versus U.S. national consumption of margarine. So it's not even people in Maine eating margarine. It's all the people eating margarine are not. In this case, margarine's going down, and so is the divorce rate. There's one more good one here. Age of Miss America correlating with murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. What a way to go. I didn't. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. We should probably come back to this one when we get to induction. There's a whole lot of stuff going on here that's pretty interesting, right? The ages of Miss America is extremely narrow band of data. The oldest being 25 and the youngest being, I guess, 18 and a bit, because, otherwise it would be really creepy if it was younger than that. It's probably creepy anyway, but that's neither here nor there. And of course, the murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects, anywhere between 2 and 8. So again, also a very small sample size, or very small data range, and that's going to create all sorts of weird statistical effects when you have very small samples when you're comparing two things. So thinking that those things are causally related because they coincide is exactly the fallacy of false cause. Just as thinking that testing causes COVID cases because they're rising together is the fallacy of false cause. Going back to our slides. So, some simple examples. The rooster crowing causing the sun to rise. And in that case, that is reversing cause and effect, right? It is in fact the sun causing the rooster to crow, but the way you tend to observe it is you don't open your eyes to notice the sun is out until the rooster crows. Uh, a, a quite popular for a long period of time in terms of the origins of life on Earth was a theory called spontaneous generation. People observe that if you have the right living conditions for things, you tend to get them. So if you have rags and grain laying around, suddenly you got mice. If you have wet protein, you get mold. Um, and then Pasteur and the process of pasteurization is the scientific discovery that if you sterilize something and don't allow new life to be introduced, that it'll remain sterile. So, false theory. Why are we persuaded by this fallacy? Well, we're in fact fairly free in attribution of cause in everyday life. And I think, quite frankly, there's relatively little cost to being wrong about these things. Um, little Homo habilis crouching by a fire in a savanna somewhere and heard some rustling in the brush behind them. Didn't think, well, now, should I examine carefully the causation of that rustling noise, or should I scramble up the nearest tree? Um, right? There's a time and a place for very careful scrutiny, and that was not the right time and place. Um, Often being wrong about causation has very little short term cost and often quite a lot of benefit. But that is fine when you're, running away from wild animal or possible wild animals in the bush, but not great if you're trying to run a country. So um, we get a lot of false positives that have very low cost, and so I think we get habitually sloppy about attribution of cause. We're going to learn that attribution of cause is really complicated, and so we're not going to worry about that today. Stay tuned, but so there's a lot of pitfalls in this. I will say also that a lot of superstitions people have, whether it's wearing their lucky socks to hockey or uh, any sort of ritual that they might conduct. Oh, my favorite team is playing today, so I got to wear the hat and the scarf or whatever because I wore that before the team won. Well, the cost of wearing that hat and scarf is pretty low. And if you thought that's what it was going to take to generate the right result, fantastic. The fact that you're wearing that scarf sitting on your couch and the game is in a whole different city probably means that the causal relationship is pretty is not a real thing. There's also some harm in being wrong about causes when we in previous times had weird beliefs about uh, disease. Oh, it's the reason I'm coughing and getting boils on my skin is because the person across the road looked at me funny, and not because there's bacteria in the water supply. Because we didn't look into the real cause of the disease, horrible things happened. So anytime we're wrong about cause, we're not going to come up with a solution. So some examples. Here is if you're in psychology, you'll learn about Pavlov and his dog. And the dog here is wrong about what causes what, right? Um, Pavlov thought that he could make the dog drool by conditioning it to expect food, and the dog thinks he's conditioning Pavlov. I showed you the spurious correlations website. There's the URL. And if you think that attribution of cause is purely a statistical problem, that website shows you that there's got to be something more to it than that. You can have and really, and I don't know the whole story there, although I should get his book and read it. But I'm guessing, based on what I see there, is he's got some computer that's just randomly searching available data and looking for correlations. So he's got these huge data sets, and he's just looking for the random correlations that pop up. And I think that's pretty smart. Probably a bit of a guy who's interested in stats and numbers. Special case of false cause is the slippery slope fallacy, sometimes called the domino fallacy. So this is, I think Canadians can probably relate to the idea of being on an icy hill and sliding to the bottom and being unable to stop. And this in logic is really that same concept that if you accept take an initial step, there will be no way of stopping. So and the presumption here is that there's once you start the series of causes is unstoppable. That's the hidden presumption. So and the argument goes something like, well, we don't want that inevitable result, so we must not grant even one minor change or acceptance or anything like that. So here's an example of slippery slope from just a couple of days. In fact, maybe even today, that and Trump is trying to insinuate that Joe Biden is on drugs, and so he's actually got probably some innuendo here. Problem is, what happens after that? That's an insinuation of a slippery slope, that once you have accept that Joe Biden might be on drugs, then and he's being vague about what the insinuation is. And this is quoted by a columnist named Tommy Beer in Forbes magazine. A big supporter of Donald Trump is a guy named James Dobson, who's an important American evangelical leader. He's got a book, Marriage Under Fire. I don't want to get involved in the issue here, but these are perfect examples of slippery slope arguments on a topic which, quite frankly, in Canada, and this is why I'm choosing this example, we did take this initial first step, and the sky didn't fall, right? So think about, Mr. Dobson is arguing that if you accept gay marriage, you won't be able to have laws against a polygamy, 3 men or 3 women, or 5 men and 2 women, or marriage between daddies and girls, or a man and a donkey, right? So these are all consequences this person thinks will be a inevitable causal chain starting from this first step. Now, Canada and quite frankly, since 2004, many places in the U.S. have in fact accepted this step, and none of them have gone to this. So the inevitability of this is clearly questionable because it hasn't happened. So that's what makes this a good example. I don't want to get bogged down into the action. This is not an ethics class. Don't want to get bogged down into that. But I think this is a great example just because society did make that choice and did not run down the slope to all these others. So when we're replying to a slippery slope, the presumption, of course, is that there is no stopping point between the initial and the final cause. And so if you want to respond, don't point out that's a presumption that is contentious. If you can say, look, I think that we're going to stop with just the genders of people getting married, not the numbers or the species, so there's some pretty natural stopping points here. Then I think you've confronted the slippery slope argument very effectively. So that's it for false cause. Next fallacy, begging the question. Also has a few interesting names. Petitio Principi is the Latin name, which is basically sort of literally saying, hey, you're assuming part one, right? Which is, and also known as circular reasoning, also known as Catch-22 from a very great novel about a World War II novel in which the army has a catch, which is that the army, in the army rule book, it says the army can do whatever it wants. And so that's circular reasoning. In the very simplest form, for any statement, therefore that same statement. Now, that's pretty obvious when you put the form that way. So usually when you're trying to slide this one by, you hide the presumption in with some other details. So you flow, some extra words around just to kind of create a little bit of camouflage. So now, what makes this one interesting is that this is going to actually be a valid argument. Remember, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true is the definition of valid. So let's look back at the form then. If the premise is true, the conclusion must be true. Well, if the premise and the conclusion is the same thing, it would satisfy that definition of valid. So, I think that has a whole lot to do with why this is a fairly persuaded argument. It sounds pretty clinching. So, for that reason, there is no counterexample as we've learned that, where you would have a obviously true premise leading to an obviously true false conclusion. So this would be, by the way, be a really great question on a quiz. That can a fallacy be valid? Explain. So, pretty persuasive because it sounds kind of iron, clad. It sounds watertight. Of course, if A, then A. And so now if you want to respond to that, you have to sort of point out the circularity and reject it, which is harder than you think. So here's a great example. The news is fake because so much of the news is fake. Well, as an argument, that's wraps up in a bow pretty nice and tidy. Now, is the news fake is exactly debatable. So, I'm not necessarily going to accept the conclusion as true, but as an argument, it doesn't get any better. A couple, exciting examples just to keep you awake in case you thought there's never going to get any controversy at all. So, the Bible is the Word of God. The Word of God cannot be doubted, and the Bible states that the Bible is true. Therefore, the Bible must be true. Well, you can see how that makes a circle. And, whether or not the Bible is true or not, this argument has the feature of being valid. So that's something. But it seems to assume exactly what it's also trying to prove. And so we would want to be cautious about that. I think that when you see these circular arguments, the right approach is caution. Say, listen, I'm going to need some other evidence besides just restating itself. The same one here. Active euthanasia is morally acceptable. Is a decent ethical thing to help another human being escape suffering through death. So now this is where we're starting to get into hiding the circularity a bit more subtly, right? So this is a circular argument, but it's one that isn't obviously so the way this one here is. Um, Now, why is it circular? Well, because morally acceptable is pretty much exactly the same thing as decent and ethical, and helping another human being escape suffering through death is pretty much what we think euthanasia is. So, what we really have here is the same statement twice using synonyms. And so that's why it's a circular. It's really the form X, therefore X, where the second time X is expressed, it's using different words to say the exact same thing. Some harder ones. So murder is morally wrong. Active euthanasia is morally wrong. That is a circular argument if you grant the hidden premise, something's implied here, that active euthanasia is the same as murder, which is, of course, a different definition than was previously used. And really what's going on in something like this euthanasia debate, or quite frankly, any of the other sort of controversial examples here, is what's up for debate isn't the structure of the argument, it's the definition of the terms. If you assume the definition of term in here, you get to your conclusion automatically. But in fact, assuming active euthanasia is murder is pretty much exactly what the argument is trying to prove. You can't start by assuming that. Capital punishment is justified for the crimes of murder and kidnapping because it is quite legitimate and appropriate that someone be put to death for having committed such hateful and inhuman acts. Well, again, capital punishment, put to death, justified, legitimate, and appropriate, crimes of murder and kidnapping, hateful and inhuman acts, right? So we just have three synonyms leading to the same statement again. A special case of question begging is the question begging epithet. Let's talk about the word epithet first. That's that, pithy slogan. Maybe it goes on your tombstone, right? Here lies Professor Phil. He tried his best. Whatever, is, COVID, lecturing in COVID finally did him in. Whatever, that epithet, that slogan, sometimes it's a single word. And if you can hide your conclusion inside that, then you have circularity. So notice this criminal is charged with violently murdered the innocent victim. Well, notice that when you use the word criminal in that way, because that word criminal has, at least in its legal sense, the idea that the person has been found guilty. And so when you describe them as a criminal, then you kind of get ahead of yourself and saying, well, they must be guilty because they're a criminal. And so here's an example here taken off of, I'll just see if I can't get this a little clearer. There we go. Taken off of Facebook, I think, earlier today. And this is about Black Lives Matter stuff. Probably a straw man here, for those of you who want to go back and look. Please kill I always hear the same sentiment from the left. They knew the risk when they took the job. I'm not sure people are really saying that. That sounds like a straw man to me. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is here. How come we can't apply this logic when criminals are killed during arrests? They knew the risk when they did the crime. Okay, so how do I know they're doing crime? Because they're criminals. Well, that's exactly that circular epithet, right? If you call someone a criminal, of course it's legitimate to bring the force of law down on them. But they're not criminals all the time, right? So that's the circularity here. Now, if we said, how come we can't apply this logic when innocent civilians are killed during arrests? They knew the risk when they did the crime. Well, suddenly that sounds pretty objectionable. So, depending on what words you put there, is going to really influence how effective the argument is. Okay, so that's circular reasoning. They got a couple more examples of this, some straightforward ones. Bill O'Reilly once said he can't believe Jon Stewart because he's a liberal New York Jew. That epithet, at least for his audience, means something very specific about trustworthiness. Um, the Ground Zero Mosque was words cooked up in some political office somewhere to describe an Islamic cultural center. It wasn't at Ground Zero. It was only sort of a mosque. But by calling it that, it made a huge political issue out of something. So those are question-begging epithets, hiding your conclusion inside a name. And you know, I was going to say I hate to pick on Donald Trump all the time, but actually I kind of enjoy it. But this is one of his favorite tools, is to give someone, the nickname. Lion Ted, Sleepy Joe, Lion Hillary. If he can get you to believe someone's name is, Lion Ted, you're probably not going to believe what Ted says. So that's question begging epithets, part of circular reasoning. When you're looking at circular reasoning, and if you think you're confronted for it, your options are pretty limited because, after all, it is a valid argument. You can't say, "Aha, that's a fallacy. It's not a good argument," because it is. It's an ironclad argument. It really is guaranteed to be valid. And the other thing is, let's face it, the vast majority of people are not going to appreciate your logical subtleties when you point them out. To say, aha, circular reasoning, and maybe some of you have already experienced this. We're starting to learn about fallacies, and you're around the dinner table with some grouchy relative, and you say, aha, that's the fallacy of, and they're like, they don't care, right? They think you're some overeducated elite. Question begging epithet. So, so pointing out the circularity is useful if you have other people that also want to do their best to be good thinkers, but that's unfortunately rare. So, a more useful strategy is to try to break the circle by asking for more information. Sure, he's lying, Ted, but when exactly did he lie so much? Okay, the Bible's the word of the God. Got any other evidence? Might be a way to sort of to enlarge, try to get out of that circle by saying let's try to add some more evidence. What I mentioned, that not everyone thinks that circular reasoning is bad. This is from a website. I should check if it's still up there. I ripped this off of that website some years ago. And I think it's fantastic just because the person who put this together actually thinks circular reasoning is awesome. He calls it the wheel of power. For every question, you have a great answer. And so how can we be sure it's the word of God? Because the Bible tells you so. But why believe the Bible? Because it's infallible. How do you know it's infallible? It's the word of God, and around you go. And I don't want to be unnecessarily negative about this. I think that there's plenty of good reasons to have sincere religious belief. This person thinks that this is really great. I'm hoping that we see that we would want to have some more evidence. It would be sort of unsatisfying if this was the end of it. We would want something more. Next fallacy, sweeping generalization. There's other names for this, also known as, aka, fallacy of accident, or dicto simpliciter, which is just Latin for you're saying it too simply or without qualification. And the form is, if usually X is an A, then X is an A in a particular case. So this is actually, I think, from the same Facebook conversation as the criminal crime one mentioned a few moments ago. In the case of kids, they're usually kids with nothing better to do, so they're involved in gangs or whatever. Uh, Poverty plays a huge role. None of these things. So notice that usually here goes to a universal claim, right? We get mostly as a mostly, typically, usually a word that covers most but not all, and then suddenly we get to none and all kinds of words in the conclusion, and so that's the problem with these. Going from usually to every time is unreliable. Now, we rely on this quite a bit, right? If something's usually the case, in ordinary life, when there's not too much on the line, go for it. But if you say an airplane's usually safe, are you going to get on? Right? So notice our standards for going from usually to always are going to be contextual, and that's part of what's going on here. I would argue in the case of the police violence case that police officers are usually pretty good is both true and not good enough, right? We want that to be universally true, not just usually true, even if that usually is some incredibly small percentage. Counterexample, remember something that's obviously true, and then a premise is obviously true, obviously false. So just based on the evidence here, this person is from Beverly Hills, and therefore she must be rich and famous. Not, I hate to judge people just, on a superficial glance. Could be that this is a famous actress researching a role as a bag lady, but, could also just be what it seems. Very famous example from Plato, and these accident and converse accident fallacies often get described in logic textbooks as, and then there's a little sort of tangent on moral reasoning right after, because historically, it's ethically problematic to go from usually to always, right? So the case Plato described when he was discussing ethics is the case of a friend who has a sword that belongs to the other person, and has promised, okay, when you ask for the sword back, I'll give it to you. I've borrowed it, or you've given it to me for safekeeping. When you ask for it back, absolutely, you'll get it back. And then that friend shows up drunk and mad and angry and says, our mutual friend, I'm going to get your sword and I'm going to run him through. And Plato asks the obvious question, what do? Do you return the sword as you promised? Or do you break your promise, save your friend's life? And quite frankly, since the penalty for murder in that society was also death, they're both going to die, right? Your drunken friend is going to die as punishment for murdering your other friend. You're going to lose two friends. What do? And it seems like although usually you should honor your promises, there might be exceptional cases. And that sort of discussion of universal principles like keep your promises versus the subtleties of very particular individual cases is a lot of what you talk about when you're doing ethics and philosophy. And the idea that every principle is universal, I think, is shown to be a weak assumption based on an example like that. When you're looking at sweeping generalizations, usually I try to think of counterexamples that are based on what a lot of people call the law of large numbers. So someone says, "Oh, the number of cases of police violence to innocent civilians is absurdly rare." You say, "Well, actually, if it's only 1/100%." And there's 300,000, or at least in Canada, say 35 million people, that means a couple thousand cases a year. Okay, that's not good, right? So the law of large numbers is that whenever something is, no matter how small a fraction of a percentage something is, when it happens repeatedly, you're eventually going to get something measurable. And so, yeah, even if something's usually safe or rarely happens, let's say like airplanes, if they're just usually safe and there's thousands of them taking off every day, they're going to crash if they're just usually safe. We need it to be guaranteed safe. I taught medical ethics many years ago to first year doctors, and it's really kind of funny because they're taught in med school that if a risk is less than 1 in 1,000 cases, then it's a negligible risk, and they don't really need to get into it with the patient. And I always argued with those really smart people that, wait a minute, two things. First of all, that patient you're saying 1 in 1,000 isn't significant. They might bought a lottery ticket that's like 1 in 1 billion and think they have a serious chance at winning. And so your perception of odds versus theirs is totally different. The second thing is, you, the doctor, how many times are you going to perform this operation, right? If the risk of injecting a vaccine or doing a medical surgery is 1 in 1,000, probably you're going to do that 1,000 times over the course of your career. So it's going to happen to you, the doctor, even if it's unlikely to happen to the person, the patient. And so I hope I convinced some of them to treat risks a little bit more seriously than I think the message they were getting at the time. This is a long time ago, okay? So I think it's better, but I always had qualms about that. Genetic fallacy. This is a subcategory of the sweeping generalization. This is where the sweeping generality comes from something about the origin. Now, genetic here refers, this is the word genetic in fallacy is actually older than the word gene as a biological term, right? Genetic is just a word synonymous with origin, so that when they're trying, what do we call these little things that are part of DNA? Let's call them genes. That's actually using the same root word. So this is not genetic as in 23andMe or whatever the DNA stuff. This is origin fallacy. So when you rely on the origin of something to draw a conclusion, then you have genetic fallacy. And the example that comes first to my mind here is the prostations Donald Trump makes about the origins of the Russian investigation. That the people who started that investigation are people that are probably not big fans of Donald Trump. And so the origin is suspect. And then he thinks that therefore the entire investigation should be discounted. So that's exactly the genetic fallacy. Origin, therefore conclusion. The hasty generalization is the reverse of what we've just been talking about. So this is going instead from usually to all. This is now going to from some to all, right? So that we have and often we call this anecdotal evidence, right? So my uncle drank like a fish and he lived to be 94, so being an alcoholic doesn't affect your health. Well, that's a single case. You would want more substantial investigation before you drew that conclusion for everyone. Why is this persuasive? I'll invite you to think about cooking a pot of pasta. And you're able to, after a few moments have elapsed, to say, I wonder if it's done. And you pull out a single strand, and whether you stretch it, this is a cultural thing, right? Some people stretch, some people throw, some people taste. whatever your social tradition is, great. Notice the important part is your that single strand is taken as an indication of the readiness of all the pasta in the pot. So why, if a single case is good for the pasta, is a single case not good for alcoholism and health? And I think that's exactly the problem here. Excuse me, we're not particularly good at judging when samples are fairly measured by individual cases and when we need much more data. The reason it works in the pasta case is just because all the pasta is the same. Imagine you were, it's getting to the end of term and you're a little short on money, and you and your roommates in your social isolation realize that you've only got a little bit of ordinary pasta, and then you've got some whole wheat artisan made pasta from the farmer's market, and you've got some quinoa pasta that's gluten free, and maybe you've got the shells and the strands and spaghetti and macaronis, and you throw it all in a pot. And then you pull out a single strand of spaghetti and you say, well, this is done, so I guess it's all good to go. You realize pretty quick that the mistake is not all those pastas are going to cook at the same rate. And I would say when you draw sweeping generalizations about anything, especially people, you want to ask yourself, are we all from the same pot or are we coming from different places? Because if we are, I shouldn't judge all by the one. And so the mistake is always saying on too little evidence, we're going to go to too large a sample. Some examples, if we allow sick people to use marijuana, we should allow everyone to use marijuana. Well, I guess Canada went that way. I once had a student argue with me after hearing that I had allowed a student with a diagnosed disability to have an alternate exam format. Argued that the perfectly able and ready student should be given the same consideration. I would argue in that case that the exceptional nature of the one case did not apply to all students. So hasty generalizations are often based on individual testimony. We sometimes call that anecdotal rather than aggregated results. Sorry, as the light conditions keep changing here, I gotta just sort of adjust these. I think this is a made-up quote I got from somewhere, but I interviewed 10 people on Main Street in Greenwood on Friday night, and they all stated they would rather be there than watching TV. I conclude that the folks in Greenwood don't like to watch TV on Friday night. Now, you don't need to be a super critical thinker to see that there's some problems here, right? Did you see, okay, 10 people, not that many, plus they were on Main Street on Friday night, and that makes sense because if they did rather watch TV on Friday night in Greenwood, they wouldn't have been out in the street to get interviewed in the first place. So here we have a reporter making all sorts of anecdotal conclusions based on pretty shoddy basis. And folks, we're going to see over the next 40 or so days on the news every night. There's going to be interviewing some biker or trucker or lawyer on the street in some town in anywheres USA, and then so you can see that everyone's voting for so and so or such and such, right? To the extent that you take that seriously, it shouldn't be on the individual case. It should be on a more systematic way of measuring that, which is what polling is going to be. And we'll probably try to do, I don't know if we're going to get to induction around the time of the U.S. Yeah, actually, the timing might work out. That we'll do some look at induction pretty much on U.S. election day. We'll see whether the polls were accurate or not. That might be a pretty good thing to look at. Okay. So, hasty and sweeping generalization, I think of them as two sides of the same coin. So let's think about which side is up when. So we want to, if we want to know if it's hasty or is it sweeping, we want to know where's the general statement. If the general statement, that's the all statement, the every. If it's in the premise, it's a sweeping conclusion. If it's in the conclusion, it's a hasty generalization. So in the examples, sweeping generalization, most P's are S's, therefore this particular P is an S, right? So you're going from the most is in the premise. Hasty, this particular is an S, so the particular is in the premise, therefore the generality is in the conclusion. So let's look at an argument. It's time to start getting serious here and start looking at some examples. So, is this a hasty generalization? Cyclists all think they own the road. I nearly ran over one yesterday who turned right in front of me. Okay, so there's an argument. What do we need to do? So some of the basic concept stuff, we need to say, okay, what's the premise? What's the conclusion? Are there any indicator words? Well, this example is pretty typical of the way we speak ordinarily, which is we don't give ourselves a whole lot of help, right? I don't see a therefore. I don't say, oh, here's the premise. No one's marking this up with on a whiteboard to say premise, line, conclusion. So what is the conclusion here? If you're not sure, one of the things you want to do is, well, try it both ways. Okay, so let's assume cyclists all think they own the road. Therefore, I nearly ran over one yesterday who turned right in front of me. Does that make sense? Did you run over one because cyclists think they own the road? Let's try it the other way. I nearly ran over a cyclist yesterday who turned right in front of me. Therefore, cyclists all think they own the road. Okay, that's at least an argument that you can imagine someone making. Now, is it a fallacy? Seems like going from a particular case of one cyclist to all cyclists seems like a hasty generalization. So that's how, as we assess these fallacies, that's how we're going to be doing this. I'm going to end the part one of the fallacies of presumption here. For those of you who are enjoying the Donald Trump examples, let me just say this. It seemed at first like the only benefit of having Trump elected president was that we were going to have 4 years of fabulous fallacy examples. The man is just a fallacy machine. So much so that there's a book called Fallacious Trump, a website and a book and a podcast. If you want Trump fallacies, they got them. Okay, so if you want to learn about fallacies, letting Donald Trump do something for you, I recommend this podcast, and you can go through the podcast episodes, and he does one on every particular fallacy, so you can look at that for the fallacies we've covered. I'm also, even though in my time teaching critical thinking, never before has someone so been, such blatant use of fallacies, plus been so newsworthy that a lot of people knew what he'd said on a day-by-day basis. It seemed like a huge gift for teaching logic. So at the same time, I've learned over the last few years that Trump also elicits such emotional reactions in people that it's really hard to actually assess his statements logically. People tend to either buy in or opt out, and not not follow him logically at all. So, in fact, Trump is sort of he's not the entry level fallacy maker, he's the Mount Everest. And to climb that, we need to do much more basic work first. Okay, that's it for part one. Have a great day.